Hey, thank you all for coming today. We are really pleased to have with us Dr. Phillip Gordon. He is the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He was nominated as Assistant Secretary in March 2009. He's been holding this post since May of that year. He's got a distinguished career in both the academy and think tanks and in public service. Previously served as Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council under President Clinton. He has been a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And one of my favorite affiliations, he was a Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies as well. He has a PhD from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, again, another proud affiliation that I always like to report, as a poli-sci PhD. He's the author of numerous books and articles on European security. He's going to speak to us today about the US and Europe meeting global challenges. I am also proud to say that we are streaming live on the IISS website and also in a brand new IISS iPad app. So, Bill, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Andrew, thanks very much indeed. It really is a pleasure to be back at the IISS, to see so many distinguished colleagues and a lot of old friends in the room as well. You know, it has actually been 18 years since I set off from Washington to London to join as a senior fellow. And I would just start by noting that the institute and the world have both changed an awful lot in that time. The IISS, when I was there, was already an international institute, to be sure. But in the intervening time, it has truly globalized. The fact that we're speaking now and streaming to places all around the world is indicative of that, as are the conferences that you hold in Singapore, and Geneva, and Bahrain, and elsewhere. And I think the Institute's membership now is up to over 100 countries, again, underscoring truly the global nature of this institution. What hasn't changed is the quality of the Institute's work, which remains widely read and respected all around the world. The Euro-Atlantic community itself has changed considerably since my time in London. In 1994, which was when I arrived, NATO, if you recall, was still agonizing over whether to operate out of area. The European Union still only had 12 members. The Balkans were at war. Russia was coping with economic turmoil and the loss of an empire. And at that time, Europe's economic problems seemed to stem not from the existence of a common currency, but from the lack thereof. Today, the challenges are very different, but arguably even greater. Indeed, while I think we all need to remind ourselves not to fall victim to the fallacy that the problems we face today are worse than ones previously faced, I do think it's fair to say that in 2009, President Obama inherited a global agenda, frankly, as daunting as any administration had faced for many decades. He faced major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, growing nuclear challenge from Iran, the ongoing threat of global terrorism, and the greatest financial crisis since the 1930s. It didn't feel that way at the time, but looking back on those years in the mid-1990s, it really was a time of relative peace and prosperity. Transatlantic unity was also under great strain when President Obama took office. Recall the deep divisions over Iraq, the debate about how to handle the nuclear threat from Iran, the growing European doubts about engagement in Afghanistan, and a U.S. relationship with Russia that was at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War, due to tensions over missile defense, NATO enlargement, and especially the Russia-Georgia War of August 2008. According to the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Trends Survey, in 2008, just 19% of Europeans approved of the president's handling of international policies, and just 36% viewed U.S. leadership in world affairs as desirable. That was the landscape that the president inherited when he took office in January 2009. And one of the most urgent agenda items he had was to win back the world's trust, and especially the trust of our European partners. His premise was that the current challenges are so great that even America's unparalleled power could not deal with them alone. The president articulated his vision for transatlantic cooperation during a little speech he gave in Berlin in the summer, saying that partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the one way, the only way to protect our common security and advance our common humanity. He made clear that America has no better partner than Europe when it comes to the need for strong allies who can help us deal with the changing world. And let me say, this administration has invested very deliberately and consciously in strengthening the ties that he was referring to. Last week, Secretary Clinton made her 28th trip in office to Europe. She speaks regularly with her European counterparts, sometimes several times a day. President Obama has so far visited Europe 10 times. His first overseas trip was less than 3 months into his presidency. He attended a G20 summit in London, NATO Summit in Strasbourg-Kiel, US-EU Summit in Prague, and then he went on to Turkey. 2 years later, when he was speaking in Poland on a trip that included stops in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and France as well, he called the Transatlantic Alliance a foundation stone for American security. And the reason was because we share ideals, we share values, and we have taken on consistently leadership on some of the toughest challenges that face the world. This administration has not only sought to bring a new tone to the transatlantic relationship, in which we respect the positions of others and welcome the chance to talk honestly about our differences. The President has also demanded strong engagement from other countries. As he told the United Nations General Assembly in September 2009, dealing with global challenges cannot solely be America's endeavor. He warned that those who used to chastise America for acting alone in the world cannot now stand by and wait for America to solve the world's problems alone. Now, I give you the background to the President's thinking about the transatlantic relationship and his approach to the transatlantic relationship, because I want to talk about how we have delivered on that approach in the first 3 years of this administration. And 3 years into this administration, I would assert that the United States and Europe have never been more aligned, both in overall strategic goals and the tactics that we use to achieve those goals. While the foreign policy challenges today are no less pressing, indeed many exist alongside a host of new problems, we have been able to approach them more effectively because we've been doing so together with our European allies. It's not to say there aren't differences across the Atlantic, as there are within Europe, and obviously within the United States for that matter. But the reality is that we have a common transatlantic agenda, and we're putting our forces together to deal with a very challenging world. Recent opinion polls confirm the positive effects of this collaborative approach. Take the same German Marshall Fund polling that I cited earlier from 2008, and it shows that European support for President Obama's handling of international affairs was 83% in 2009, 78% in 2010, and 75% last year. I think still a remarkable degree of support for what the United States is trying to do in the world. Let me be clear that approval for our policies and support for our leadership and even working together are not ends in and of themselves. They are means to the end of a more effective international engagement to promote peace, stability, and prosperity in the United States and around the world. And I would just like to ask you to consider some of the ways in which we are doing just that on the major issues of the day. Take Afghanistan, where our European allies have been critical to NATO's efforts. With nearly 40,000 European troops on the ground fighting alongside our own, we have built and sustained NATO's largest ever overseas deployment. For a decade now, the alliance has held firm to the principle of in together, out together. That commitment has not faltered during discussions of the transition of security responsibilities to the Afghan National Security Forces in 2014, which will be one of the key topics of the upcoming NATO Summit in Chicago. Despite the current difficulties, let's also not forget that enormous progress has been made in decimating al-Qaeda's leadership. We remain committed to a partnership with the Afghan people and government as we work to realize our shared goals of disrupting, dismantling, and defeating al-Qaeda, as well as building a safer, more secure, and prosperous Afghanistan. On Libya, President Obama demonstrated leadership by leveraging unique American capabilities to create a coalition that shared the burden effectively. He made a deliberate decision to seek a UN Security Council mandate, work through the NATO alliance, and seek support from Arab states and other partners. With UN authorization, the United States used those unique assets to take down Libya's integrated air defense system in a coalition with European allies. And 10 days later, we handed command and control of the mission over to NATO, while continuing to provide the bulk of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, in-air refueling, jamming, and other critical capabilities. We're continuing to work closely with our partners on the transition in Libya. In Iran, Iran was moving closer to a nuclear weapons capability in 2009, as was evidenced by the discovery of a covert enrichment facility. The United States and Europe have together offered Iran a way to resolve differences between us through diplomacy. Iran, however, has not yet engaged seriously, and so we've coordinated with our partners in Europe and around the world on a dual-track policy to increase pressure to sharpen the choice for the Iranian regime. And I want to stress we have enjoyed unprecedented unity with the European Union on this approach, including support for UN Security Council Resolution 1929, several IEA Board of Governors resolutions, and the recent, and I would even say surprising to many, pleasantly surprising here in Washington, decision by the European Union to ban Iranian crude oil imports and to freeze the assets of the Iranian Central Bank. We're continuing to work extremely closely with the E3+3 to engage Iran in serious discussions without preconditions. And again, I ask you to contrast this to the divisions that previously plagued us over issues like Iran. When I was in London at the IISS, I wrote in a Delphi paper about differences over the Middle East, and particularly on Iran. It wasn't hard to fill up the size of the manuscript about those differences. And the point being, we have gone from that very significant differences about pressure versus engagement to what I really think is pursuing the same policy together on Iran. In Syria, the violence perpetrated by the Assad regime in reaction to what began as a peaceful opposition movement is unacceptable. Once again, we've worked closely with our European partners to steadily ratchet up pressure through multiple rounds of sanctions. We've also engaged in active diplomacy in major UN bodies to unite the international community behind the Arab League's call for an immediate halt to violence, negotiated political solution to enable a democratic transition, and a coordinated response to the growing humanitarian crisis. Last week, Secretary Clinton joined her European counterparts and leaders from over 60 countries in Tunisia to coordinate our approach to these goals and to send a clear signal that despite being blocked in the Security Council, the broader international community will pursue all available measures to secure a peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria. And once again, US, the United States, and Europe are united in doing so. Our cooperation is not just global, as is clear from some of the examples I've just given, but it also applies closer to home, or I should say closer to Europe, where the United States has again been working extremely closely with our European partners to address remaining challenges in Europe. I'm pleased to say after months of closely coordinated diplomacy, the United States and European Union both welcomed an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo last week in the EU-facilitated dialogue that the United States observes and strongly supports. That will ensure Kosovo's representation in regional forums and a technical protocol on integrated border management between the two countries. And we were pleased that the EU General Affairs Council just this week decided to recommend candidacy status for Serbia, and that the EU has also taken steps to strengthen its relationship with Kosovo. We're encouraged also by recent developments in Bosnia, including an agreement on a Council of Ministers and adoption of state budget. Once again, something that the United States and Europe have worked closely to achieve. We have also together worked to support the Swiss-mediated agreement between Georgia and Russia that paved the way for Russia's invitation to the World Trade Organization last December. And we've continued our high-level engagement in the Minsk group to find a lasting peaceful settlement to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. At the OSCE, an important forum for recognizing the crucial role played by human rights and security, the United States and European Union continue to coordinate a joint response to the troubling events in Belarus. And of course, we have worked very closely on the challenges of the Eurozone crisis. The President has been speaking very regularly to his counterparts in the Eurozone. And Treasury Secretary Geithner is obviously doing the same, has traveled recently several times to Europe to engage his counterparts. We remain confident that the EU has the will and the means not only to cut its debt and build the necessary firewalls, but also to create growth and to restore liquidity and market confidence. We welcome the steps that European leaders have taken to resolve the debt and banking crisis, including the commitment made at the EU Summit on January 30th to introduce fiscal consolidation, the economic reforms agreed to by Prime Minister Papademos in Greece and his European counterparts last month, as well as ongoing efforts, I should say very impressive efforts, by Prime Minister Monti in Italy and President Rajoy in Spain to lay the groundwork for developing more dynamic economies and addressing vulnerabilities. In addition to working with our EU partners on all of the challenges I have mentioned, I want to particularly underscore the work we have done with and on two other important countries in Europe, which is Turkey and Russia. President Obama and Secretary Clinton maintain very regular and very close contacts with their Turkish counterparts as part of a deliberate investment in that relationship, which we think has paid off. As a NATO member, Turkey has made important contributions to our joint efforts in Afghanistan, including by deploying troops. And on two areas of potential divergence, Libya and Syria, Turkey has worked actively with the United States and the international community to promote peaceful solutions. At the same time, we continue to speak honestly with Turkey about our differences, including on Iran and Israel. While we regretted and made clear that we regretted Turkey's efforts to deal with the Iran nuclear program outside the E3+3 format and its decision to vote against Security Council Resolution 1929, we appreciate Turkey's enforcement of sanctions in efforts to prevent illicit procurement. As is quite well known, I think, to this group and others, President Obama has sought to reset relations with Russia. This policy has been guided by the belief that we could cooperate on areas of mutual interest while speaking plainly about our areas of disagreement and maintaining support for our friends and holding firm to our principles. The development of a more effective working relationship with Russia has led to mutually beneficial foreign policy achievements, including agreement on New START treaty, the 123 agreement on nuclear cooperation, military transit accord on Afghanistan, and cooperation on Iran sanctions. This year, we look forward to welcoming Russia to the World Trade Organization, an agreement that was nearly 20 years in the making and something we believe will benefit Russia, the United States, and Europe. And we're working with Congress to terminate the application of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to Russia before it formally joins the WTO. Despite some initial misgivings about the reset, the value of stronger U.S.-Russian relations have been recognized by allies in NATO, as well as in Central and Eastern Europe. For example, we welcomed the Polish-Russian reset and have worked to improve coordination of issues such as energy security. We've also sought to manage our differences with Russia on Georgia by engaging the two in regular dialogue through the Geneva discussions and seeking to ensure greater stability and transparency on the ground. Finally, let me say a word about the NATO summit that President Obama will be hosting in Chicago this May. When I was working on NATO issues at the IISS, the alliance had just 16 members and had never conducted a military operation anywhere. When in 1996, as the editor of Survival, I chose to publish an article advocating NATO's enlargement to the Baltic states, some people thought I was just being provocative or maybe was a little bit crazy. Today, NATO has 28 members, dozens of partners across the globe, proven track record of providing stability within Europe and beyond its borders. NATO's ongoing missions in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and off the Horn of Africa, as well as its recent operation in Libya, demonstrate its significant contributions to global security. At a time of budgetary austerity across the industrialized world, it's worth remembering that NATO has proven to be the most successful alliance in history and provides the most effective security for its members. But we also have to recognize the need to find new ways to make our collective defense spending smarter and more efficient. NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, who's just been in Washington the last 2 days for consultations with our government, has put an emphasis on smart defense, which includes initiatives such as common Baltic air policing and common funding of alliance ground surveillance, which can both help ensure our security while minimizing costs. Summit's overarching goal is to build on decisions reached in the Lisbon Summit of 2010, and in particular, the alliance will define its collective next steps for security transition in Afghanistan, announce the completion of collective capability commitments, including, we hope, an interim operating capability for ballistic missile defense, and to recognize the crucial role played by partners in NATO operations. To conclude, the United States and Europe have made considerable progress in recent years towards addressing common challenges, including the transition to a civilian-led mission in Iraq, agreement on steps for drawing down forces in Afghanistan, and the prevention of mass atrocities in Libya. The President's approach has proven, we think, that we are more effective when working constructively together towards common goals. The agenda that is still before us, most urgently the rapidly deteriorating security situation in Syria, clearly remains daunting. And of course, there are many, many other issues that I haven't had time here to address, from helping North Africa and the Middle East in its democratic transition, question of China's emerging power, new leadership in North Korea, climate change, the threat posed by Somali pirates off the Horn of Africa, and many, many others. But I think by talking a little bit about the extensive list of areas where we are cooperating extraordinarily closely, and contrasting it, if you will, to previous periods, and I don't mean just the previous few years, but even decades before that, I think it says a lot about the approach that the President brought to this relationship and what we've been trying to do over the past 3 years and what we intend to do in the future. On every single one of the issues I mentioned, close transatlantic cooperation is an indispensable starting point. To retain an effective working relationship, countries on both sides of the Atlantic must continue, as we have done, to engage in frank dialogue, smart defense spending, and cooperative policymaking. Secretary Clinton could not have summed it up more succinctly than she did in a joint appearance with Secretary of Defense Panetta in Munich just last month, when she said, "Today's transatlantic community is not just a defining achievement of the century behind us, it is indispensable to the world we hope to build together in the century ahead." Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to taking your questions and having a discussion.
And what we will do, and thank you for that, Phil, it's a very important presentation and an impressive record of the administration in relations with Europe. What I would like to do is get a list going of questions, and I'm going to take the first one. You mentioned during your talk and at the end about the urgent and daunting challenge we have in Syria. What next for the United States and Europe in Syria? More sanctions, UN resolution? Is there a role for NATO? And is there any reflection as you all think about the difficult challenge of Syria, what lessons you took from the experience in Libya that you applied to Syria? And would there be a NATO role for, in fact, in providing the humanitarian corridors that are being discussed as a first step?
Well, thank you, Andrew. As I said, we make no secret of the fact that we know it's a daunting challenge. Nobody pretends otherwise. I think last week Secretary Clinton underscored the need for humility in thinking about what we can do in the question of Syria. Nobody pretends that there's some simple answer to the question. We have focused our efforts in recent weeks on several things. Increasing pressure on the regime, which, as I noted, we have done together with our counterparts in the form of sanctions and diplomatic pressures, and our coordination and efforts to reach out to the Syrian people and different opposition groups, which we hope to strengthen. This was a major topic of ministers in Tunisia last week. Obviously, humanitarian efforts, because whatever else you think of the transition and the politics, what is clear is that there is a truly grave humanitarian crisis in Syria, and we have been forcefully pressing the regime to allow humanitarian access, and deeply regret and condemn the fact that they have failed to do so. And international coordination, because we are determined to do this together with our partners. We also made no secret of the fact that we were deeply disappointed that the UN Security Council did not come together in support of the Arab League's plan, which included a number of these elements: further pressure on the regime, calling on everyone to put down their arms and have a negotiated peaceful transition. And we felt that the international community coming together behind that Arab League plan would send the message to Mr. Assad that he needs to leave the scene and give some hope to the people of Syria. Unfortunately, that was blocked by two members of the Security Council, I would say in quite significant isolation. Isolation that was furthered just today at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, when I think just Russia, China, and Cuba voted against Syria resolution, whereas 30-some other countries joined together. The same isolation was apparent at the UN General Assembly vote, which voted overwhelmingly in favor of support for the Arab League approach, and only a handful of countries voted against it. We're disappointed by that exception to the otherwise significant international unity on the subject. So that's the approach that we intend to pursue. There's not, you asked about differences with Libya and NATO's role, and this is a question that comes up, but I do need to stress that these situations are very different. I'd be happy to talk about the conditions that led to NATO's intervention in Libya and why we thought that was the right approach. What we said and what NATO said in that context was that there needed to be a demonstrable case that such an intervention was necessary. There needed to be clear regional support. There needed to be a sound legal basis. We felt we had all of those things. We think we went about it in the right way, and we think we brought about a major success for the Libyan people. The case of Syria is very different, and we'll continue to try to work with our counterparts to find a solution for a very difficult challenge.
Very good. The floor is open for questions. Yes, and if you could state your name and affiliation, please.
Thank you. My name is David Nikoradze. I represent Georgian television station Eurasian in Washington, D.C. Secretary Gordon. I'm wondering if you could give us your commentary about the leadership shuffle in the Kremlin. What the recent policy will be like after the presidential elections in Russian Federation. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Well, we're obviously watching with great interest, as everybody is, the Russian presidential election. We'll see how it comes out this weekend. I would just say, in general, in terms of our approach, we don't expect to change our approach to Russia, which I articulated in my speech, which is to say that we think there are a lot of important practical things we can do together. We have done a lot of them together, and we can do them while standing firmly behind our principles and support for our allies and friends in Europe. And in the area of economic cooperation and non-proliferation and counterterrorism and regional questions like Iran and Afghanistan, we have, I think, demonstrated that we can pursue mutual interests with Russia, while also being very clear about our differences, including on the question of Georgia, whose territorial integrity and sovereignty we strongly support. And it's an issue that we raise with the Russian leadership all the time, even as we work together on other issues. In terms of the speculation about whether Russian policy might change or not, we will wait and see, and it'll be up to the Russian leadership what approach they want to take. I would simply note that we have pursued this so-called reset for the past 3 years successfully, even with Mr. Putin in a critical position. If he should come back as the president, we have no reason to believe that we can't continue with the positive approach that we've taken, regardless of what particular job he holds. And surely our president will seek to work with the next Russian president, just as he has been working with the previous Russian president.
Jack Chow?
Thank you. Jack Chow with Global Health at the RAND Corporation. Very much appreciated your examination of the key flashpoints in the U.S.-European relationship. As you know, one of the great collaborations between the U.S. and Europe has been confronting the chronic and pervasive forces of disease and poverty in the developing world. The U.S. and Europe helped craft a global fund and supply the UN with resources. Because of the Eurozone crisis, some of the European governments are cutting back on their contributions to the global fund. There's great consternation about what is being called the resource asymmetry between the US and Europe in confronting AIDS and poverty. We welcome your views on this.
Well, thanks. I mean, you underscore a challenge that affects not only our cooperation on issues like health and disease, but frankly, every international challenge we face. With tighter budgets, I mean, I alluded to some of the challenges in the security field, but it also affects the field of global health and disease, and affects development. And on every single one of those, the United States and Europe are the main funders and the main partners. I think 80-some% of world development aid comes from the United States and the European Union. We will simply have to continue to make the case that even as we seek necessary fiscal consolidation that both Europe and the United States are facing, there are some things too important to leave aside. And we've been making that case in each of the areas that I mentioned. So, you know, just because we face budgetary challenges doesn't mean that the critical challenges of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria don't remain. And I think this president, this administration are committed to continuing our support and to working with our counterparts to do the same.
Igor Tkanenko, Russian Service, Voice of America reporter. Mr. Gordon, thank you for your remarks. What kind of comparison should we expect from the United States and its European partners in the recent diplomatic scandal in Belarus? There are all EU ambassadors from Minsk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, I alluded to this briefly in my remarks. It is yet another area on which the United States and the European Union are absolutely aligned. The European Union took further steps on sanctioning the Belarusian regime for its repressive policies in line with our own. Belarus responded to that by asking the EU ambassador and the Polish ambassador to leave, and the European Union in turn decided that if that's the approach they were going to take, then all of the EU ambassadors should be called back for consultation. We immediately made a statement strongly supporting that approach. As you know, we don't currently have an ambassador in Belarus because they responded to us in the same way. So once again, we're in the same camp. But the truth is that these actions only further Belarus's self-imposed isolation. And it's not going to help the people of Belarus to have this sort of challenge. The better way for them to deal with the increasing sanctions and visa bans that they're facing is not by kicking out European ambassadors, because that will only increase their isolation, but by dealing with the reasons for those sanctions and visa bans in the first place. They know what they need to do. We have made clear what they need to do. There is a positive path forward for Belarus. Regrettably, they're not taking it, and people in Belarus are suffering the consequences from that.
Thank you. Peter Rashish with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your remarks. Last November at the US-EU Summit, President Obama and his European colleagues launched a high-level working group on jobs and growth in order to explore the opportunities for deepening the transatlantic economic relationship, including the possibility of eliminating all remaining barriers to trade and investment. I wanted to ask, given the fact that the US and the EU are both advanced economies with which share a number of fiscal and economic growth challenges, what role do you see for deeper transatlantic economic integration to help the United States confront global challenges in a world where we do have a number of emerging economies? Thank you.
No, there is a role, and that's why the President and his EU counterparts decided to pursue this track. You rightly point out that trade across the Atlantic is already highly liberalized and not particularly regulated. But I am told by the people who work on such things that there is nonetheless still scope for less regulation and freer trade. And the reason the President has asked us to pursue that, I think Europeans are thinking similarly, is we do need to find avenues for further growth. I talked about the necessary need to consolidate fiscal positions, and we're doing it here. Europeans are doing it. And yet, everyone knows that if you overlook growth, you're going to have a greater fiscal problem and other problems. So how can you do that? It would be nice if you could just stimulate economies on both sides of the Atlantic and generate growth that way. But you can't do that and cut at the same time, cut spending and raise taxes. So you need to look for other avenues of growth. I think Europeans are doing this internally as they have come around to the view, which we strongly support, that you can't, all of the pressure of consolidation can't be done with fiscal policy and austerity. You have to find avenues for growth. We appreciate how Prime Minister Monti is talking about this, Merkel and Sarkozy, other European leaders. And so I think that needs to be done within Europe, but also needs to be done across the Atlantic, and that's why the President has tasked our team to try to get it done.
Yes.
Good morning. Corinne from Le Monde. About one of the topics of differences between Europe and the United States has been Israel and Palestine. So would you, Mr. Netanyahu will be here next week, the President's going to talk and to have a speech. Would you address the expectation you have on this meeting?
Obviously, there's some hugely important things going on in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians, in the Arab world as a whole, and in Iran. And that certainly provides a huge agenda for the important meetings between the Israelis and President Obama and the team here next week. I'm not going to set expectations and talk about what we hope and expect. I'd simply say that I would simply just underscore that there's so much important business. It's going to be a critical opportunity to share views with our Israeli partners on all of those topics.
Right here at the front.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Visa Skanac from Embassy of Croatia. You've talked a lot about the Arab Spring, Libya, Iran, Syria, but you've not really talked about the reset of relations with Egypt, especially with the regime's indictments against IRI workers there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity to address that, both the broader question of Egypt and the specific case of NGOs, which has been a very important priority for this government to ensure that these people who have been doing what we consider to be good and important work for NGOs do not have their travel limited and are not subject to what we would find to be unjust prosecutions. We've been working that very carefully, not just us, but together with our European partners, because as you know, a number of European countries have people in the same boat. And I would simply say we continue to work it. There has been some progress in discussions on this, but we need to see full freedom to travel for all of these people. And again, it's been something we've taken very, very seriously at the top levels of our government, and once again, together with our European partners. More broadly, we do have concerns about trends in Egypt. Getting that transition right is critical for the entire region. Egypt was one of the first countries in the Arab world, following Tunisia, to launch what is now known as the Arab Spring, and it's not just it was an early one, but a critical one in the center of the Arab world. And so we are committed. Secretary Clinton was just in North Africa, of course. We know the stakes, and we know Egypt's importance to the stakes, and we'll continue to do what we can to promote that transition.
You had mentioned in your talk the important development between Serbia and Kosovo. Could you just elaborate a little more on that, and what are the next steps now in Serbia's accession, or candidacy, I should say, for the EU?
Sure. Our basic approach to the Balkans in general is driven by the view that Europe will not be complete until all of Europe is fully integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions and benefits from the same stability and democracy and prosperity that is so prevalent in Western Europe. You know, I made various comparisons to the 90s and the Cold War, and it is safe to say that Europe has made enormous progress with the expansion of NATO, expansion of the European Union, but it's also important to say that the job isn't done yet. And even if now when we talk about transatlantic things, as I did, we spent a lot of time on Libya and Syria and Afghanistan and Iran, we don't overlook the reality that still in Europe are important challenges. We talked about Belarus, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Balkans. And I think you can be sure that we continue to invest in working with our partners on those questions, even as we deal with the very obviously big global strategic challenges. And Secretary Clinton herself, even while she was in London for a Somalia conference, in Tunis for a Syria conference, and consulting with North African governments on the Arab Spring, was also taking the time and investing the energy in working with our European partners to promote Serbia's EU candidacy, to promote Kosovo's intensifying relationship with the EU, and to promote the agreement between the two. And so we were pleased that this EU-facilitated dialogue, and I stress again, Europe is in the lead. We have major stakes and we're very much involved, but questions like candidacy are obviously a European decision, the EU decision. But we strongly supported that. We're very pleased when they reached an agreement on Kosovo's participation in regional organizations. We strongly support Kosovo's sovereignty and independence, and now the idea that it can show up and speak for itself in regional international meetings is very important. So we supported that. The technical agreement on managing the border was also another step. Many more still ahead of us to be sure, but another important step towards normalizing that relationship and towards treating Kosovo as the country that it is, and towards facilitating Serbia's candidacy for the EU, which would be huge for the entire region. So that was an important step, one on which we in the European Union were again in lockstep, something that was not always the case in the 90s when I was working on these issues from London. But again, part of our deliberate strategy to do it together with Europe, and we applaud and encourage those agreements and want to see Kosovo, Serbia, as well as many of their neighbors continue down the path to European integration.
Jim Lowenstein. Phil, we seem to be in a period of Euro bashing in this country, and I'm not aware of any high-level statements supporting Europe's efforts to deal with the Euro crisis. So I'm going to provide you the opportunity to do that. And secondly, what is the United States prepared to do, do you think, over the next year to support Europe's efforts to deal with the Euro crisis?
I'm not sure, Jim, what you mean by the absence of high-level statements supporting Europe's efforts in the Eurozone crisis. I feel like the President has addressed this a number of times publicly, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury clearly supporting European efforts, expressing our confidence that they have the will and means to do so. We have been clear about all of those points and will continue to. We have an enormous stake in the success. Now, when you specifically ask what we're prepared to do, that may be what you're alluding to or looking for, but part of what we're saying is that first and foremost, this is a European challenge to deal with. Questions like policy of the European Central Bank and decisions by the European Council and bailout funds and the European Financial Instability Facility and the European Stability Mechanism. We have views and we share those views, but we're not participants. And so it is for the European Union to, and European member states to lead on this and to make the tough policy decisions that they need to make. But nobody should have any doubt at all that we have a huge stake, that we're very much engaged and we're very supportive. And I would even go so far as to say we're encouraged by the seriousness with which European leaders seem to be going at this. They have created a firewall. They have reached an agreement with Greece that has involved private sector participation. They have taken very serious steps on fiscal consolidation, and they've made a few references to specific countries like Italy and Greece and Spain. A certain number of months ago, we were all wondering, was their political leadership capable of dealing with the problems? Would they make the tough budgetary choices? They now have, I would say, very impressive governments who are doing just that. So there has been real progress, and while every recovery is fragile, we're strongly supporting this one and are hopeful and believe the Europeans are doing what they need to do.
Andrew Pierre, good to see you, Phil. You've already said quite a bit about Russia and the United States. I'd like to ask about one or two dimensions of that. As you go towards the Chicago Summit, we seem to be lining up pretty well, or the Europeans lining up pretty well with us on missile defense. But I'm not sure we've come to a real agreement of any sort on missile defense with the Russians. So that's one dimension of my question. The other is, more broadly speaking, as we move towards a difficult and long period of arms control negotiations with the Russians, how is that developing in your judgment? And finally, if Mr. Putin is reelected, do you think the Russians will accept Mike McFaul as a good ambassador of the United States to Moscow? Or is that a continuing problem and a festering problem, so to speak, in terms of the overall tone of Russian-American relations?
Thanks, Andrew. You are right. First of all, that we have made good progress on missile defense with our allies in NATO, and as I suggested, we expect NATO to be in a position to announce an interim operating capability for ballistic missile defense in Chicago, which is really a huge deal. The President believes that there's a growing threat from nuclear proliferation, ballistic missile proliferation. We need to be in a position to defend our European allies, their territories, our forces in Europe, European populations. Every member of the alliance has agreed with that. NATO came together in Lisbon to agree that we should support the European phased adaptive approach to missile defense, and you're well aware of the American contributions to that with interceptors in Poland, Romania, and we've agreed, Turkey has agreed to host a radar, and the Dutch have agreed to equip their Aegis ships. And Spain has agreed to import such ships. There's a lot of European support for the alliance as a whole and different allies behind this. You're also right that we have yet to agree with Russia on precisely the way forward. We made some progress in Lisbon. We hoped and hope to reach a common agreement with Russia because we believe that this is in our mutual interest. It's not targeted at Russia. We've been very clear that it's targeted at growing threats from beyond Europe. It doesn't have the capacity to undermine Russia's strategic deterrent, and we're very clear about that, but we're also clear about the President's determination and the Alliance's determination to proceed with all four phases of European missile defense. So we will continue to talk with Russia. We would like, between now and Chicago, to reach a mutual agreement so that we can proceed on that basis. But if that's not possible, then we'll just have to accept that it's not possible. We'll continue to work with Russia and try to find a way forward. We have made some progress on cooperative theater missile defense cooperation with Russia. But on the European phased adaptive approach, there's clearly still work to do. More broadly on arms control with Russia, we again remain prepared to engage. We spent a significant amount of energy and effort last year in trying to find a way forward on our differences over conventional arms control in Europe. And ultimately, that effort faltered over issues such as what we believe is the core principle of host nation consent. And I would remind you, Russia's failure to implement the CFE treaty in terms of sharing data, which they had ceased to do for several years. So that's another issue on which more progress needs to be made, and we'll take it up again with the new Russian president in the same transparent way we did before. About Ambassador McFaul, I would simply say you're alluding to some of the unfortunate treatment he has been subject to in Moscow. Obviously, we strongly support the ambassador and have raised these issues with the Russian government, which assures us that they will take every necessary step to ensure that that he gets the treatment that that ambassador deserves. I hope that this is an episodic thing surrounding his new arrival and the election, that it goes away, and we'll work with Russian counterparts to ensure that no longer becomes an issue.
Sanjin Choi and Lam Partners. Thank you so much for lucid and succinct remark. Could I follow Ambassador Lowenstein's comment, Eurozone crisis? At the moment, there's never-ending Eurozone crisis resolution for risk package in Greece is almost in fatigue crisis. And but following your comment about U.S. commitment, at the moment during Euro crisis, I do not see any agreement by troikas, European Central Bank, as you mentioned, IMF, and European Union commissions dealing with what to do with the Eurozone. And with regard to U.S. commitment high level, I do not see any way this current administration can increase quota for IMF in election year. And U.S., UK, and clearly indicate they are not willing to do so. And I would be interested in your views. With regard to Greece accounts for only 2% of GDP. However, they are concerned about speed of impact and firewall. I do not see any sufficient firewall has been created at the moment. And what is your view as Greece is prepared for upcoming election April? Will they able to stick to the agreement by Troika? Thanks.
Well, thank you again. You raise fairly challenging questions that we've all been grappling with. You say you don't see a Troika agreement. I mean, there is a Troika agreement with Greece. Greece agreed to meet the conditions of the Troika. Progress has been made. The German Parliament strongly supported it just last week. No doubt, difficult times ahead, and we've seen how hard it is to implement agreements that have been reached. But this one is moving steadily, if slowly, along, and the agreement is in place. The Troika agrees to support it. Greece has agreed to do what it needs to do, and as I said, we believe this is a step in the right direction. The IMF is playing a role in the Eurozone crisis with the resources that it has, and I would simply not disagree with your assessment that further U.S. funding for the IMF in this context is unlikely. Election year, not election year, we don't see extra U.S. contributions to the IMF as the path forward here. It's part of what I meant in underscoring the European lead on this issue, but I also stress that we believe that Europe has the means and the will to do so. We've all debated what precise size the firewall needs to be. And Europe has taken steps and is still debating whether it should be bigger and whether the ESM should be merged with the EFSF. Fortunately, so far, that has been a theoretical question, as opposed to testing whether the firewall is big enough. I would argue that with the degree to which markets have stabilized over the past couple of weeks and months, it's even more theoretical than it was then, when we were all really concerned that it might be tested. Our view is that the main importance of a big firewall is so that you never have to use it, never have to find out whether it was big enough. And that's why we've been advocating a significant enough firewall so that markets don't feel the need or any interest in testing it. And again, given the progress that has been made, not just on interest rates, not just in Greece, but in Spain and Ireland and Italy, so far at least, it appears that the firewall has been sufficient, and hopefully we'll never find out the answer to that.
No, just to put in a plug for an upcoming program, Francois Heisberg, who is the chairman of the IISS Council, one of the top intellectual policy intellectuals in France and Europe, will be speaking on the Euro crisis here on Tuesday, March 13th. So those of you who are interested, you are welcome. If I could, you raised so many issues in your presentation. I want to mention one more. You talked about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and let me ask the question this way. In 2009, Secretary Clinton invested quite personally in diplomacy between Turkey and Armenia in a framework that seemed at the time and on paper to be a breakthrough, really, in relations between those two countries. Could you tell us where that process stands and how you're moving ahead in Turkish-Armenian relations?
Sure. The Turkey-Armenia protocols of 2009 were indeed potentially huge breakthrough in a region that has been frozen with poor relations and non-relations among different countries and even war and economic sanctions. Those protocols paved the way for normalization between Turkey and Armenia, which we strongly supported, and that's why the Secretary invested so much of her personal time in achieving that. And we made no secret of the fact that we have been disappointed that the protocols that were negotiated and signed between the parties haven't been ratified. In Turkey, we are told that the parliament is not prepared to ratify, and we regret that because we think that, as I said, this would be a huge step forward for the region. It would benefit Turkey and Armenia economically and diplomatically, and we continue to raise it. The Turkish foreign minister was here just this past week, and Secretary Clinton raised it in that context, as she has so often before, because we continue to believe, even after several years of failing to move forward, that the path forward is there, and the countries continue to have an opportunity to do so. And we'll continue to push on that, and I'm sure she will personally, every opportunity she has, because we have a stake in that sensitive part of the world, and we have important friendships with both Turkey and Armenia, and we very much want to see this get done.
Well, we've drawn to the end of our hour, and it's been a pleasure to have you and to recognize your intellectual leadership on European security issues at the IISS and Brookings and elsewhere, and your policy leadership and U.S. policy in dealing with Europe and the Eurasian countries. So thank you for taking the time today.
My pleasure.